My name is David Smith, and I'm presenting the case study on The Caught in the Path, a story about Ruskin Heights tornado of 1957 by Carolyn Glenn Brewer. I'll begin by reviewing the disaster details, and then I'll delve into book specifics, which will include several personal accounts from survivors as they experience the various phases of emergency management. After that, I will look at the enduring effects of this storm had, both with local impacts on Kansas City area as well as national impacts. Before I conclude, I will also briefly review some of the other accounts that are fairly well documented with this disaster. Jumping into it here, the Ruskin Heights tornado was the deadliest single tornado to strike Kansas City. It occurred on May 20th, 1957. In a post-storm analysis, it was determined the storm touched down in Williamsburg, Kansas, and remained on the ground for 71 miles as it tracked to the northwest and lifted back in the sky in Blue Springs, Missouri. The event killed 44 people, but injured 531 while damaging 842 structures that were mostly residential. The tornado was classified as an F5, which is the largest, and was documented to be over a half-mile wide. Some very pertinent details to note were that there were no weather sirens installed in the area, and up until this point, weather radar services for identifying tornadoes was very experimental. Even when positive ID was made, the Weather Bureau at the time, surprisingly, had regulations that forbade forecasters from issuing what we know today as tornado warnings. Joe Osley, the weather forecaster on duty that night, went against policy and issued a warning via news and radio networks 30 minutes prior to impacting Ruskin Heights suburb. He thought he was actually going to be fired over that decision. Now, having a basic understanding of the event, I can now review some of the book details. The author takes the approach of using personal accounts from survivors to tell the story. Although it does allow the reader to be pulled more into the story, it tends to be a bit distracting because there are so many personal accounts, over 80 in total. Each phase of the storm is reviewed with each of the survivors, and the author only offers a couple of paragraphs of introduction into each phase of the storm before allowing the accounts of the survivors to take over. I found the read very interesting and heart-wrenching, but in order to establish familiarity with the survivors' names, I had to read the book twice. I will now review some of the more notable accounts so you can feel a little bit of what they went through. The pre-storm synopsis offered by the author sets the error for the reader. Post-war troops wanted to settle down, families began to move away from urban areas, and they wanted to settle in the suburbs. Ruskin Heights was a suburb constructed very much like the assembly line. No customizing was allowed, just 4 models were offered, and only one had a basement. This mindset left very few of the residents prepared with any protection for tornadoes, even though they lived in an area that was vulnerable to them. As the storm progressed to Ruskin Heights, one of the most remarkable stories was from Robert Jackson. He says, "When the tornado was 150 feet away, I saw this terrible thing coming. It was black. It was very black, just like mud. It had water and mud and everything in it, and it started slapping me on both sides and banging me against this tree. At one moment, my feet were straight up in the air. The next, they were on the ground. Then the blackness disappeared. The wind decreased to a near calm, and it became light. I realized as I looked up I was inside the funnel cloud. I can't describe it. This column just mounted straight towards the heavens, and then the back half hit me." Treva Woodling had a horrible experience after they tried to get shelter in the church basement that was nearly 2 blocks away. Having not made it, she says, "I didn't see where Diane, who was almost 5, and Dean, who was 2, but I grabbed a hold of our 3-year-old Denise's arms. It just seemed like for a second or two that time stood still. I looked at her face. Time was frozen. She was just petrified. I will never forget the look on her face. I had a hold of her arm for as long as I could before the storm pulled her away." The author accounts for some of the response as well. The police stepped up in the response force. The largest problem they saw was that they had problem dispatching ambulances and finding drivers. When the ambulance driver could not be found, police officers were actually given authorization to drive. As ambulances ran out, squad cars and private cars were then used. Jack Brams summarizes the hospital situation. "There was chaos for 10 or 15 minutes, but most of our doctors had worked in the Army, and we switched over that way of thinking very quickly. We set things up very much like a clearing station during wartime. We put a tag on a patient, make a quick survey of the injuries, then get them to where they needed to go." Donna Williams sums up her post-storm experience. "The next day we found out how badly we were actually all hurt. When my dad came to the hospital, he didn't even recognize my mom. You couldn't lay a quarter on her without hitting a bruised or bloody spot." During the recovery phase, martial law was declared by the governor nearly immediately, and the National Guard was dispatched. The Salvation Army and the Red Cross played a large part. The Salvation Army arrived within 90 minutes after the tornado. The Red Cross had an office set up in time to serve morning coffee. Many local debts, surprisingly, with furniture companies and other institutions were erased, and as the country learned about the disaster, aid poured in. Clyde Rankin says this, "A bunch of men came walking through the area and wanted to know if we could use some help. I thought they were looking for paid work. It turns out they were Mennonites, and they wouldn't take any money for their hard work." Walt Bodine, the newscaster, said, "One thing The 1957 disaster did was make us realize how important it was to have a coordinated plan amongst the local hospitals. The two hospitals now have a coordinated communication system. Concluding the book details, to show the continued post-traumatic stress that occurred, Dorothy Katsifikis says, for many years the kids would hear those trains coming in the middle of the night and they would think they were going through it all over again. They woke up screaming many nights. The event has had a lasting effect obviously in the Kansas City area. Weather sirens were installed, the previously mentioned tornado warning ban was removed nationally, and now forecasters were able to call it a tornado if they suspected it. As mentioned, coordination between local hospitals occurred to ensure they could assist each other with patient loads. After that storm warnings that were often disregarded were never ignored by citizens. Citizens would now come to celebrate these occasions by having what they call basement parties in their new basements or shelters. There are not too many documented accounts of this disaster, so the story is quite consistent amongst them. The author of the book actually published a very similar book from the perspective of the children of the disaster, to show how their lives were impacted. A survivor of the storm was inspired to continue a career in meteorology as he grew up. Mike Smith published a couple books, but most notably Warnings, discusses what came from the disaster. His focus is on the previously mentioned Weather Bureau's ban of the tornado warning announcement and the heroic role that Joe Owsley served that night in issuing that warning. Walt Bodine did an hour-and-a-half radio broadcast that aired shortly after the tornado. It summarizes this event very nicely, and actually I wish I had listened to this before reading the book. All of these add value to understanding the disaster, certainly. In summary, I've covered the disaster, book specifics, some of the enduring events, as well as some of the other publications that provide a very consistent storyline for this event. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to your questions.